Hello, Lobbert here. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. I put a lot of effort into these videos because I want to earn that from you. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Special thank you to Brad for hosting the game. Check out his podcast, the PDH Pod. It's a great source of Pauper Commander news, tips, and tricks. There's a link in the description to skip the rundown of each player's commanders if you'd like to get right to the game. Lobbert is going first with Sonorous Howlbonder, a 2/2 human warrior for 1 and 2 hybrid black-red with menace, and each creature you control with menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. Wales is playing Noggle Ransacker, a 2/1 Noggle rogue with, when Noggle Ransacker enters the battlefield, each player draws 2 cards, then discards a card at random. This decklist comes from Sniffhow, a member of the PDH pals, who host great live content. You can find a link to their content on the Noggle Ransacker decklist in the description. Radrak V's commander is Cormela, Glamour Thief, a legendary 2/4 vampire rogue for 1 blue, black, red with haste, and 1 tap, add blue, black, red. Spend this mana only to cast instant and or sorcery spells. And when Cormela, Glamour Thief dies, return up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, and going last is Infamous Fridge with Battlefield Butcher, a 1/4 human soldier with 5 tap. Each opponent loses 2 life. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each creature card in your graveyard. Each player keeps their opening hand and the game begins. Lobbert draws for turn, plays Thriving Moor Naming Red, and passes. Wales draws, plays Sandstone Needle, and passes. Brad draws, plays a swamp, and ends his turn. Infamous Fridge draws, plays Desert of the Glorified, and passes. Lobbert draws, plays Snow-Covered Mountain, and Arcane Signet. He passes. Wales draws for turn, taps, and removes a counter from Sandstone Needle to play Izzet Signet. He follows that up with Prismari Campus and passes. Brad draws, plays a mountain, casts Mind Stone, and ships the turn to Infamous Fridge. Fridge draws, plays a swamp, and passes. Lobbert draws and plays his commander, Sonorous Howlbonder. Next, he plays Rakdos Carnarium, which returns the mountain to Lobbert's hand. He then passes. Wales draws a card, plays a mountain, and his commander, Noggle Ransacker. Each player draws 2 cards and discards a card at random. Next, he ends his turn. Brad draws, plays a land, and Compulsive Research, so he draws 3 cards and discards Ash Barrens. He moves to his end step and discards a mountain to hand size. Infamous Fridge draws for turn, plays a swamp, and his commander, Battlefield Butcher. He goes to his end step and discards Gravedigger to hand size. Lobbert draws and enchants his commander with Sticky Fingers. He attacks Wales for 2 commander damage and gets a treasure off of Sticky Fingers. After combat, he plays Crowl Raider, Black Dragon Gate naming red, and passes. Wales draws, plays an island, and Aether Tradewinds, targeting Lobbert's commander and his own commander. The creatures return to their owner's hands, and Wales expends the last counter from Sandstone Needle to recast Noggle Ransacker. Each player draws 2 and discards a card at random. Wales passes. Brad draws and plays Carrion Feeder. He then casts Wrangle targeting Noggle Ransacker, so he gains control of it, it untaps, and gains haste. He attacks Wales with it, so Wales takes 2. After combat, Brad sacrifices Noggle Ransacker to put a counter on Carrion Feeder. He plays Dimir Aqueduct, which returns a swamp to his hand, and he ends his turn. Infamous Fridge draws and plays Mindrack Harpy. He goes to combat, which triggers the Harpy, so each player mills 3. Fridge remains at 1 creature in his graveyard. He passes. Lobbert draws for turn, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, replays his commander from his hand, and attacks Brad for 2. After combat, he plays Sweatworks Brawler, using its Improvise ability. He passes. Wales draws, plays an island, and pays 5 for Noggle Ransacker. Each player draws 2 and discards a card at random. Fridge goes up to 2 creatures in his graveyard. Wales goes to his end step and discards a land to hand size. Brad draws a card, plays an island, and Lampad of Death's Vigil. Next, he plays Mark of Mutiny, targeting Sonorous Howlbonder to gain control of it, untap it, give it haste, and put a +1/+1 counter on it. He attacks Lobbert with it, so Lobbert takes 3. After combat, Brad pays 1 to activate the Lampad, sacrificing Howlbonder, so his opponents each lose 1 life and he gains 1. After that, he ends his turn. Infamous Fridge draws, plays a swamp, and his own Lampad of Death's Vigil. He goes to combat, so his Harpy triggers. Each player mills 3, which brings Fridge's graveyard up to 3 creatures. He attacks Brad with his 3/2 flyer. Brad takes 3, and Infamous Fridge passes. Lobbert draws for turn, plays a snow-covered swamp, and pays 5 to recast his commander. He attacks Brad for 3 and Wales for 2. Each player takes the damage. Lobbert passes. Wales draws, plays an Opal Palace as his land, and Crimson Fleet Commodore, which makes him the monarch. He passes and draws off of the monarch. Brad draws a card, plays a swamp, and targets Crimson Fleet Commodore with Portent of Betrayal to gain control of it. Wales responds with Curfew. Wales returns the Commodore to his hand. Brad returns Lampad of Death's Vigil. Infamous Fridge returns his Lampad as well, and Lobbert returns Sweatworks Brawler. Brad plays his Lampad again before passing. Infamous Fridge draws, plays a swamp, Lampad of Death's Vigil again, and Scrapwork Rager, so he draws a card and loses 1 life. Next, he begins combat, so his Harpy triggers, and each player mills 3. Fridge's graveyard remains at 3 creatures. He attacks Wales for 3 with flying. Wales takes 3. Infamous Fridge becomes the monarch and passes the turn, drawing off of the monarch. On his end step, Lobbert targets the Harpy with Go for the Throat, destroying it. Fridge discards Bladebrand to hand size. Lobbert draws a card, plays a snow-covered mountain, and goes to combat. He attacks Wales for 2 with his commander, and Infamous Fridge with a 2/3 with Menace. Infamous Fridge blocks with all 3 of his creatures. Wales takes 2, and Lobbert's creature trades with Scrapwork Rager, which brings Fridge to 5 creatures in his graveyard, which makes Battlefield Butcher's tap ability free. After combat, Lobbert plays Sweatworks Brawler using its Improvise ability again and kicks Stronghold Confessor, so it enters as a 3/3. He then passes. In his end step, Wales plays Opt to scry a card to the top and draw a card. He starts his turn, draws, plays Forgotten Cave, and replays Crimson Fleet Commodore, which makes him the monarch. Next, he targets the Commodore with Reckless Charge, which gives it +3/+0 and haste this turn. Wales attacks Brad for 8 with Trample. Brad takes the 8. Wales passes and draws off of the monarch. Brad draws, plays Mortician Beetle, and passes. In his end step, Infamous Fridge taps his commander. Each of his opponents lose 2 life. He starts his turn, draws a card, plays a swamp, and plays Infectious Horror. He passes. Lobbert draws for turn, plays an Ash Barrens as his land, and enchants Sonorous Howlbonder with Necromantic Thirst. He then attacks Wales for 2 with his commander, and Infamous Fridge with his 2 3/3s. Infamous Fridge blocks the Sweatworks Brawler with everything. Lobbert orders Fridge's blockers from left to right. Lobbert targets the Brawler with Rush of Vitality to give it +1/+0, lifelink, and indestructible this turn. Wales targets Lobbert's commander with You Come to a River to return it to his hand. Infamous Fridge then targets Battlefield Butcher with his Professor's Warning to give it indestructible. Lobbert gains 4 off of the lifelink, and Infamous Fridge takes 3. After combat, Lobbert plays his commander from his hand again. Wales draws, plays a mountain, and moves to combat. He attacks Lobbert with both of his creatures. Lobbert pays 4 life to play Snuff Out targeting Crimson Fleet Commodore. Wales counters that with Counterspell. Lobbert does not block and takes 7. Wales passes and draws off of the monarch. Brad draws a card, plays a mountain, and passes. In his end step, Infamous Fridge taps Battlefield Butcher to have his opponents each lose 2 life. He untaps, draws, and plays Skittering Surveyor, which puts a swamp into his hand. He plays the swamp, and then a Bushmeat Poacher. Next, he attacks Wales with Infectious Horror. The horror triggers, so Fridge's opponents each lose 2 life. Wales casts Unexpected Windfall, discarding Azure Fleet Admiral. He draws 2 cards and makes 2 treasures. Wales takes 2, and Infamous Fridge becomes the monarch. He passes and draws off of the monarch. Lobbert draws and casts Siphon Mind. Each of his opponents discard a card, and he draws 3. He plays a command tower and goes to combat. He attacks Infamous Fridge with his 2 3/3s and his 2/2 commander. Fridge blocks Lobbert's commander with 3 creatures. Lobbert orders the blockers from left to right and casts Brute Force to make his commander a 5/5. Bushmeat Poacher dies, Infamous Fridge takes 6, and Lobbert becomes the monarch. After combat, Lobbert plays Loathsome Curator. He passes and draws off of the monarch. Wales draws for turn, casts Spellgorger Weird, and flashes back Reckless Charge, targeting the Weird to give it +3/+0 and haste this turn. The Weird triggers, so it gets a +1/+1 counter. He then targets the Weird with Distortion Strike to give it +1/+0 and unblockable this turn. The Weird gets another +1/+1 counter, and Wales goes to combat. He attacks Infamous Fridge with his unblockable 8/4, Fridge takes 8, and Wales ends his turn. Brad draws and plays Chain Devil. Brad sacrifices Lampad of Death's Vigil. Infamous Fridge sacrifices Skittering Surveyor. Lobbert sacrifices Stronghold Confessor, and Wales sacrifices Noggle Ransacker. Mortician Beetle gets 4 +1/+1 counters. Brad then plays his commander, Cormela, Glamour Thief, which he sacrifices to put a counter on Carrion Feeder. Cormela returns Fling to Brad's hand, and Brad passes. In his end step, Infamous Fridge activates Battlefield Butcher to make each of his opponents lose 2 life. He then starts his turn, draws a card, and plays Witch's Cottage as his land, choosing not to use its ability. Next, he plays First Sphere Gargantua, so he draws a card and loses 1 life. He then pays 1 for Withering Necromass, and goes to combat. He then attacks Wales for 2 with Infectious Horror, so each of his opponents lose 2 life. Wales blocks with his Crimson Fleet Commodore, so their creatures trade. Infamous Fridge passes. Lobbert draws a card, plays Felwar Stone, and voices that he doesn't have good attacks, so Wales offers to give evasion to 2 of his creatures. Lobbert says that he would like to leave up blockers, so he only wants to attack with his commander. They agree to do that, so Wales targets Lobbert's commander with Defy Gravity to give it flying this turn, which triggers Spellgorger Weird, so it gets another +1/+1 counter. Lobbert attacks Infamous Fridge for 2 commander damage. After combat, Lobbert plays Cursed Minotaur, passes, and draws off of the Monarch. Wales starts his turn and casts Distortion Strike off of Rebound, targeting Spellgorger Weird, which gives it +1/+0 and unblockable this turn. The Weird gets another +1/+1 counter, and Wales draws for turn. He plays Muldrifter, which draws him 2 cards. He plays an island, and tells Brad that he's too worried about the Fling in his hand to let him live unless Brad agrees not to kill him with it this turn cycle. Brad agrees to the deal. Wales plays Fire Diamond, which gives the Weird another counter. He moves to combat and attacks Lobbert with his unblockable 8/7. He targets the Weird with Serpentine Ambush to make it a base 5/5 this turn. It gets another counter, so it becomes a 12/11. Lobbert takes 12 and is eliminated. Wales becomes the Monarch and passes, drawing off of the Monarch. Brad draws, plays a mountain, and sacrifices Mindstone to draw a card. He enchants Muldrifter with Unhallowed Pact, and targets it with Go for the Throat to destroy it. The Muldrifter is returned to the battlefield under Brad's control, so he draws 2 cards. He then sacrifices Muldrifter and Chain Devil to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Carrion Feeder and Mortician Beetle. He goes to combat and attacks Wales with his 5/5 and 8/8. Wales takes 13 damage and is eliminated. After combat, Brad sacrifices Mortician Beetle to cast Fling to deal 8 damage to Infamous Fridge, who responds by sacrificing First Sphere Gargantua to activate his Lampad of Death's Vigil, which makes Brad lose 1 life and Fridge gain 1. Fling resolves, so Infamous Fridge goes to 1. On his end step, Infamous Fridge activates Battlefield Butcher to make Brad lose 2 life. Infamous Fridge starts his turn, draws a card, and activates Battlefield Butcher one last time to eliminate Brad. Congratulations on your win, Infamous Fridge. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider subscribing for more Pauper Commander content and giving me a like. I put a lot of effort into these videos because I want to earn that from you. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Check out the playlists on this channel for more videos like this.